click subscribe and hit that bell notification. Let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 6, and we're going to go through 16 through 23. In chapter 6, 1 through 15, you get a very joyful, excited experience of going out to serve God, going out to worship Him. They're bringing the ark in. Something goes wrong. David learns a really hard lesson, and in my opinion, doesn't tell us. It just says that David was afraid of the Lord. In my opinion, he learned what it meant to be afraid of the Lord, to have the fear of God. And that lesson is propelling him forward into a new lifestyle. He's really driving into the commandments of God. He's driving into the Torah and the Old Testament and discovering that God said that when you do this thing, you must do it this way, that God must be worshiped in a very particular manner. So David learned that. They go back a second time to pick up the ark and to bring it into Jerusalem. And every 6 steps or every 18 feet, they were sacrificing animals. So they'd walk forward, they were singing and rejoicing, they'd sacrifice a bull, and then they'd continue to carry the ark. Now we get into chapter 6, verse 16. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place, inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his own house. So what are we talking about here? What's happening? Something goes into Jerusalem, they do some things, some people say some stuff. What happened? David brings the ark to the tent. And where is it? Jerusalem, otherwise known as, we studied this the other day. What's another name for it? Zion? Jebus? I think that's all of them. That's a side note. He brings the ark in. They're excited. They're worshiping. And somebody's there. Who's there? The daughter of Saul and David's first wife. So there is a very long history, and we are going to get into this. So they bring in the ark. Here comes the ark, and then here comes the king. What's he doing? He's dancing, he's shouting, he's praising God. What do we call that, Elizabeth? He has zeal for the Lord. He's excited, he's rejoicing. They're offering sacrifices to God. And then here comes Michal. And what does she do? She's upset. She's angry. And who's she angry at? David. What does it say that in her heart? What happened in her heart? She despised David. So we have the ark, we have the king, and we have a bitter woman. A very bitter, she is upset. Now, verse 17, they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. Why is that statement shocking? Why is it that this is one of the most notable verses in this text? The reason why this is so shocking is because David made a tent for the tabernacle. He built one. Did he need to build one, or was there already one? When they built the Ark of the Covenant, they built a tent for it. It was the tent of meeting or the tabernacle. Do you remember the story where it says that God was a column of fire and a cloud of smoke? And it says that he filled the Holy of Holies. That was a tent. There was a fence. There was a tent in the middle. There was the first section, the holy place. And then inside of that was another section deep inside known as the Holy of Holies. And the ark dwelt in the Holy of Holies. And they could only go in there once a year. And when they would go in there, they would kill the blood of a lamb. They'd take it in and they'd sprinkle it on the mercy seat for the forgiveness of sins. This is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Well, that whole tabernacle's gone. We don't know what happened to it. The text doesn't tell us. What we know is that the Ark of the Covenant was gone for 20 years. It was in this guy's house for 20 years. David went to go get it, and he brought it into Jerusalem, and he had to pitch a new tent for it. So it's a question that we can't answer, but it is shocking because it is such a historical, fundamental location for the Israelites to worship. This was the tent that God had created for the place of worship. The last that I know of, it was in Shiloh. So God had his temple in Shiloh, and they took the ark from there, and then they lost it. And then who knows if the Philistines came in, the Ammonites came in, somebody came in and potentially burned it down. I'm sure there's lots of traditions. I'm sure there's lots of like, oh, this is what happened. But biblically, it doesn't tell us. We just know that it's gone, and now there's a new one. And this is going to springboard us into chapter 7. Because chapter 7, David's heart hurts. David's heart is concerned for God's house. And he says, God, you dwell in a tent, but I live in a home. I need to build a house for God. And that's what's going to generate that. David looks over at the little tent that he made, and I'm sure that David tried. He put lots of energy and effort and money and resources into building this tent, but it is not the tabernacle that the Lord had built. And he says, God, you need a proper place of worship. And he's going to cry out to God and say, I want to do this. And it's going to springboard us forward in the story. So that's why that verse is so shocking. It's kind of hidden in there. If you're not thinking about it, you're like, oh yeah, where is the tabernacle? Okay, so verse 17, and David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. What's a burnt offering? What's it for? It's a sacrifice for the forgiveness of your sins, otherwise known as a sin offering. So they would be slitting the throat of the animal, gathering the blood, sprinkling it on the four sides of the altar, and then butchering the animal and burning it to ashes. You wouldn't eat it. It would be fully consumed. Sin is to be fully dealt with. That is a burnt offering. And then you have peace offerings. What's a peace offering? Peace offerings can be different things. It doesn't have to be an animal. It can be loaves of bread, flour, different types of mixtures. There's lots of rules and regulations to it. And then you would offer that saying, God, thank you that we now have peace with you. It is the concept of gratitude and being grateful and giving praise and worship, giving God back what he's given you. He's given you a plentiful harvest. He's given you lots of children. He's made peace with your enemies, and he has made peace with you. And so you're going to give thanks and worship God with a peace offering. Verse 18, and when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed to their own place. So there was a great day of worship, a great day of feasting. They were rejoicing. And then the shepherd stands up before the flock. This is the king of Israel, and he blesses everybody. And he says, God bless you and keep you and protect Israel and build up his heritage. And in 1 Chronicles 15, there is a song of praise to God to say, worship him, remember his works and his glory and how he rescued us out of Israel. And may he protect his people. So David is leading the people back into worship with God. And what's interesting is, in the days of the judges, like let's go back 75 years or so, in the days of the judges, people weren't doing this. They went about 500 years without really worshiping God like this, as a community, as a unified body of Israel with one person saying, let's worship God. What would happen was everybody would go worship all these other gods, and then one person would come up and then go tear down all their altars and say, you have to worship the one true God. And there was a lot of division in Israel. And so this is a monumental day of rejoicing and unity with Israel, where the king is really being solidified as the ruler of Israel. And more than that, he is the intermediary between God and man. He is leading people back to God as a whole people, saying, we will worship the Lord. The Lord of what? Hosts. Because they are the host. They are the Lord's hosts, and he is the Lord of hosts. And then he gives them donations and they depart. So let's say there's 1 million people and he gives everybody a goodie bag. How much does that cost? More than $1 million? This really shows us the luxury that is being given, that David's not holding back. He's paying for everything, either through the government agency or his own finances with his household. He's leaning on his government agents, like the rulers of thousands, and he taxed the people. But they sacrificed animals every 18 feet. There was lots of food to be had. They would sacrifice them, they would cook them, everybody be eating and rejoicing. And then they went home not only full, but overflowing. They had extra abundance of provision. And in our day and age, we're used to stopping at McDonald's and getting so full that you don't want to eat anymore. But in this day and age, in David's time, food was money. Food was life. And people were skinny because they didn't always eat. And having one meal a day of meat meant something. That's why they would celebrate and they'd butcher an animal, because to have meat was the idea of luxury. So he gave them raisins and bread and meat, and he provided an abundance of resources for all the people who showed up to worship. There was none left out. Everybody got some. And what genders were there? Men and women. That's going to be important in just a second. So we're going to talk about David and Michal. We discussed it earlier. Michal is David's first wife. He's got 4 wives by the time we get here. Michal's the 5th, but she was the first. And we discussed that she is the daughter of Saul. So there is a lot of history here. I'm going to call it herstory, because we're going to talk about her story. Can anybody remind me of the beginnings of Michal and David? Where were we? What happened? Yeah, Mike. David kills Goliath, and the promise to the man who can kill Goliath was to marry the king's daughter. So that was one, he already earned it. That was the promise given. He was to receive it. He was set up to marry Merab, Saul's daughter. Saul at this point became very jealous of David, because when they were marching out to go to war and marching back, the parades would start shouting and singing, Saul killed 1,000 people and David killed 10,000 people. And so Saul gets very jealous and envious of David. And so instead of giving Merab to David, he gives her to somebody else. And then Saul conspires and he says, Michal loves David. Michal really cherishes David as a man. If I give my daughter Michal to David, I can trap him by having him go and fight the Philistines. Why should I kill him when the Philistines can kill him? And so he tells David, I will give you my daughter if you will give me the foreskins of 150 Philistines. They might even be like 200. First off, we find that she is madly in love with David. She highly admires him. He's a wonderful man, and I want to be with him. And so it wasn't as if she was being sold into slavery. She was excited to be David's wife. To remember, David was the #1 guy in Israel. David had the #1 pop song on the radio, and everybody loved David. So to be fair, Michal just kind of fell in with the crowd. Now, they get married, and Saul starts to chase David. Michal comes to David when they're at home, and she says, my father wants to kill you. If you don't leave right now, you'll be dead by the morning. So Michal actually saves his life in 1 Samuel chapter 19. She sends him out the window, takes an idol, puts it in the bed, and puts goat's hair on it to make it look like David's sleeping. The soldiers come, and then she sends him away, saying that he's sick, and then her dad shows up. King Saul shows up and says, give me David now. And he finds out that David's not actually in the bed, but that Michal conspired against him. So the father is now mad at the daughter. And what did Michal say? She said, David threatened to kill her if she didn't let him go. So to cover up for herself, she said that her husband threatened her life, and that's why she let David go and conspired against her father. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, at this point, David has been gone for years. David has been on the run. Saul has been pursuing him with armies. And David is just fleeing for his life for years and years and years, one place to another, and going in circles for about 14, 15 years. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, it says that Michal was remarried to another man. Saul gave her away to another guy. Then David comes back later, becomes king of Judah, talks with Ishbosheth, the king of Israel, and what does he demand? He wants his wife back. David says, I paid for her with the foreskins of the Philistines. She's rightfully my wife, and I want her back. And that's the law. So Michal gets picked up by Abner, and he delivers her back to David. And who is wandering after Michal? Her second husband, 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 14, verse 16. And her husband went with her, weeping after her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go, return, and he returned. It doesn't say anything about her crying. It doesn't sound like she's all that upset. Nothing said about her. But that's been her journey. Okay? So she started out as the princess who was married to a lovely man who then disappeared from her life, and she was remarried to somebody else, remaining the princess. And then he comes back, takes her home, and then her old husband is abandoned. And now she's with David. Does that make sense? Long story longer. So here's some questions for you. What was her life like when David was exiled? David's gone for 15, 20 years. My timeline's longer than most people. Most people would say that he's gone for about 10 to 12 years. I think he's gone longer than that. What would her life look like? Who's her father? The king. So is she in pain? She's suffering? Would the princess be married off to a bum? Probably not. Some political official, some important guy, somebody who's powerful, has money, can protect her, can provide for her. So for the last 15 years, she's been living a relatively decent life. Not that life back then was easy for anybody. Life's not easy for anybody now. We have it so much better. But when we look at her life, it's not terrible as we think about it. What was her life like when she returned back to David? So pretty much the same. When she was with David before, how many wives were there? One wife. When she gets taken back, how many wives were there? There's 4 other women. She's the 5th. And she's the new one in the gang. She was the OG, but now they've all moved on. David's been living his life without her. And he's been through some things. Now she's still being provided for. She still has resources. She's still kind of a gem in society, but she's not happy. Something's happening to her. It could have been in the past. It could have been in the present, but her heart is getting hard and full of bitterness. And what was her relationship with God? What was her relationship towards God? Now, this is inference. We're just thinking about it. The Bible's not telling us, so we have to think about it. When your parent is a bad parent, what happens to the children? You tend to have bad children. Like the sins of the family tend to continue on in the family. If you have an alcoholic father, you most likely have alcoholic children as they grow up. An abusive father leads to abusive children. Saul's relationship with God was really, really good for a blink of a second and then became disastrous. Saul was not a godly man, and his daughter was not a godly woman. So she is half-hearted, half-interested, and less than participating in the worship of God. She, at this moment, is found where? David's bringing in the ark. She's watching this whole scene saying, like, I hate that guy. To despise is to consider unworthy of respect. She did not think he was worth respecting. She disregarded him and cast him aside. He's not my husband, or he's not a good man, or he's not a good leader. whatever is going on in her heart, she despised him, considered him dishonorable, disrespectful. Her walk with God is a window seat. She is sitting at the window, watching at a distance what's happening. She's not participating. She's not partaking. She didn't go with him. And it would lead us to say initially, women weren't invited. Well, she couldn't go. Only the men could go. But the text told us that two genders were there, that David was leading the congregation of the people. It was men and women. He provided provisions for men and women. She chose not to go. She chose not to participate in the worship of God. When they married 15 years ago, she was a lovely princess and he was a handsome warrior, and they were a match made in the palace. David left. Well, we have focused on David for months and months and months. David's life has been living hell for years, and her life has been heaven on earth for years. And they both changed. She changed for better or for worse? Worse. David, he changed for better or for worse? For better. What's the difference? Why would his tragedy, sorrow, suffering change him for better, and her comfort and luxury and ease of life change her for worse? She did not have a genuine relationship with God, and David did. Now, David's not perfect. We've covered that because he's walking with the Lord. So let's go back through this one more time, and we're going to read the text to look at the relationship that David and Michal has. So verse 16, so she saw him, and her heart became hard and calloused. It became frustrated and bitter. She looked at this man that she once cherished and hated him. Now, David in verse 17 through 19, what is David doing 17 through 19? What's his heart like? I'd say he's grateful. As somebody who's been through a similar scenario as David, having lost everything, lived in the wilderness, right? I went to prison for a couple of years, lost everything. And God has so graciously brought me back to a wonderful blessing of a life. The level of gratitude that I have for who he is and what he's done for me, it's shocking. And you can't help but just sit down and think, God, you are so good, and I don't deserve your mercy. I don't deserve your grace, but you have given me more than I could ever think or even ask. And that's what David's going through. He has been annihilated time and again. And now he's bringing God home. He's bringing God back to the place where he belongs in the heart of Israel to be worshiped. And he is excited. This is the best day of David's life. He is so excited that he can finally worship God again. If we remember his complaint against Saul, Saul was pursuing him and chasing him. And one of David's complaints was, you have cast me out from God's people, and I am not able to worship, and it is not right. I have done no wrong. There is no sin in me, and God will judge between you and I. That was part of David's journey. He was isolated from the things of God. He was cast out from the place that he longed to be the most. And then you have Michal. She's in the palace. She's in the heartland. She's in the people of God. She has the opportunity to worship God. She has the opportunity to hear the word, to walk with the Levites and be taught and instructed and to grow in holiness. She has every opportunity to draw near to God, and she becomes bitter and callous. She lacks gratefulness. In fact, she, in my opinion, blames God for what's happened in her life. That her life has been too hard and too difficult. Verse 20, and David returned home to bless his household. Now, I've had days like this where I am so excited to get home and tell Ruth. Like today was pretty exciting today. I've been praying for my coworkers, and I haven't had an opportunity to talk to them about Jesus. And I was getting discouraged because I haven't shared the gospel in a couple months. And I'm like, man, I'm losing my zeal. I'm losing my spark. God, I'm sorry. I'm so focused on work. I'm so focused on all my problems in my life. I want to focus on you. And so today I finally got the opportunity, like full conversation with my coworker, full gospel. And he's like, I've never heard that before. He's like, no one's ever explained that to me. And I'm like, yeah, isn't it great? That's why we call it the good news. And I'm just so excited. So then I go home to tell Ruth about it and she's upset. She doesn't want to hear it. That's not real. But that's what happened to David. He wants to go home and he wants to share the blessing with his family, the people who matter the most to him. And he is excited to bless them with his experience that he had with God. And she chastises him and she kicks him in the teeth. He brought blessings. What did she bring? She brought curses. She trash talked him. She tore him down and tore him apart. You know what she called him? She pretty much called him a drunk peasant. She says, you're acting like a foolish commoner. You're acting like an idiot. You need to straighten up. She calls him out and she says, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. She's calling him a dog. She said, you glorified yourself. You didn't glorify God. You made it all about you. She talks about uncovering himself. David wasn't wearing a king's robe. David wasn't wearing a king's crown. David put on a tunic as a priest. He aligned himself with the worship of God, not the rulership of God's people. And he was jumping up and down and dancing and running around, and she thought him to be foolish. Back in this day, you'd have tunics that go all the way down to your feet. And if you showed a little bit of ankle or leg, like calf muscle, it's very shameful. Men wouldn't show their legs, particularly women too, right? Just for sexual reasons, but men, it was very shameful. So if they needed to run or go into battle, they'd gird up their loins and they'd tie their belt and their legs would be showing, but they need to do that because it's life or death scenario. But if you're an honorable person, if you're a reputable member of society, you don't do that in good company. That's not how you act. But David is dancing and jumping, and I'm sure he picked up his tunic, was running around, he's excited, he's taking 6 steps and then laying on the ground, just worshiping God. And she took offense. She was sensitive that he broke her opinion of polite society. Now remember where she comes from. She comes from royalty. She comes from the higher echelon of people. She's like, this is not how we act. That is not our people and how we do things. You're acting like a vulgar person who reveals himself. He didn't actually get naked. Just got to clear that up. David's response, verse 21, I think is the root of the problem. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as a prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I think she's mad that he's the king. I think she's mad that God replaced her dad, that God replaced her family as the royal bloodline. And she's taking it out on David. And David cuts straight to the core. I can imagine him putting his finger in her face. He says, God chose me, and I will rejoice before the Lord. He made me the ruler over his people. You're not going to take that away from me. Verse 22, I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. If you think this is bad, if you think that me worshiping God the way that I have done today, I will do even more so. You're going to get even more offended. He didn't back down. He didn't relinquish. And he said, you have the problem, not me. And if it is shameful to worship the Lord, I will still worship him. Verse 23, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. 2 questions, I guess. Why does it say that? And how could that happen? If it had to be between the two parties, I'd say it was probably David. David would, if it was going to be a man-instituted punishment, David would have said no. Primarily because he has other wives. But secondarily, because to have children is the strength of women. Women are honored with the children that they have. Women are exalted for bringing babies into this world, particularly in biblical times. And for her to not have a child is shameful. Which also leads me to believe that David wouldn't do that to her. That's not his character. He doesn't hold grudges. He doesn't return eye for an eye. We found that with Saul. David was very, very patient, very slow to anger, and never returned upon Saul what he deserved. Another thing is that she was married before. And again, she would want kids. This is like part of society. We expect men to have jobs. Well, women are expected to have babies. That's a fact. Like if you don't have kids, there's something wrong with you. That's a societal thing. So for her to have another husband and not have any children, it leads me to believe that she's barren by natural consequences, that she's incapable of having kids. But it's told to us here because she is doing something here. She is fighting against David, but in doing that, she's actually fighting against God. And so the author, the narrator, wanted us to know, like, hey, you remember this woman? No children for the rest of her life. God is not happy with her, is the implication by the narrator, the author. He wants us to know that she was not blessed with children. Not that if you don't have kids, you're cursed. It's just a simple fact that the narrator is trying to make that a point. Okay, so all that to be said, what are some takeaways that we can learn from this text? What can we apply to our life? I really focus on Michael in this text. I think a lot of people focus on David and worshiping and stuff, but Michael has been a burden in my heart because I feel like it's so easy to become Michael, and it's very common to see this type of person in church in our lives. They come around a lot. So who is she upset with? God. You sure it's not David? I mean, it seems like she's upset with David. I wonder if you were to ask her, hey, how's your relationship with God? I wonder how she would respond. You think she'd say it's good? I think she'd say it's okay. I mean, I'm Jewish. I'm an Israelite. My dad's a king. I've always known God. God's always been a part of my life. We've gone to do sacrifices a couple times. It's good. There's no problem here. She had an acquaintance with God, but she didn't actually know him. And she reminds me of the Pharisees a lot. The Pharisees thought that they were really close to God. And then Jesus shows up and shows them that they're not. I feel like what's happening with David is David shows up and he's doing all this crazy stuff and he's changed. David went out, this young boy, and came back this zealous man for God and just this warrior king who stands for what's right and wrong. And I think this is shedding light on her in her whole life. And she takes offense at it. And so what Jesus says in chapter 8, John chapter 8, verse 41, the Pharisees said to Jesus, we were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God. They're like, we are children of God. And this is what Jesus says, if God were your Father, you would love me. For I came from God and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. This is the height of self-deception. She has deceived herself into believing that David is the problem, that he has caused all of these things to go wrong in her life. But secretly, she's at war with God. She can't see, she can't hear, she can't understand properly because she's all twisted up in her heart and in her mind. And I think that was through years of hardening. As she started out in love with David, and one day she hates David, something changed, and it wasn't fast, it was slow. That's what happens with our walk. It changes not quickly, but slowly. Either it's increasing or it's decreasing, upward or downward. So this is called the gall of bitterness. The gall of bitterness and hardness of heart increases over time. The Pharisees had become so rigid and hard that when God showed up on earth, they couldn't see him. When their Savior arrived, they couldn't behold him. They thought they were so righteous, they were so right with God, that when Jesus got here and pointed the finger at them, they thought there was no way that he was right. It was impossible that they could be wrong because God loves them. They are the children of God. And I think she was in that mindset. There's no way I'm wrong. You're wrong, David. I mean, I've done everything right my entire life, and I'm a perfect person. What have you done living out in the wilderness and picking up all these wives? Let's turn to Proverbs chapter 28, verse 14. Blessed is the one who fears the Lord always, but whoever hardens his heart will fall into calamity. David feared God. Michal didn't. She hardened her heart. And this is the breaking of the bond between these two people. So let's break them down. David versus Michal. David brings blessing. Michal brings cursing. David is humble. Michal is proud. David is grateful. Michal is bitter. David is tender-hearted, and Michal is hateful. He makes a way of salvation, and she is a snare. Do you remember what Saul said when he gave Michal to David? One, I want to get the Philistines to kill David. That was one thing he said. The other one was, I want to give my daughter to him so that she can be a snare. I want to give her to you. I want to put her in your life to cause him problems. Saul knew that his daughter was flawed and she had problems, and that if David married her, she would cause him problems. I wonder, when God sent David away by allowing all of that stuff with Saul, if God blessed David by removing Michal away from him. And then when David got home, he brought her back into his life, and it became a snare again. She became a problem quickly. So he was in Hebron for 7 years, and then he went to Jerusalem, and that's generally when he picked her up. So she's been there for maybe a year, and they're having this type of fight. She is a snare by design. Her father sent her out to trap David. And this is what the devil does. He sends out his children to become a snare for God's people. She acts like David is the problem because David is a servant of the Lord. David is the anointed, the chosen, the called. And she is at war with God. Therefore, she is at war with God's people. Next week, we will be talking about the Davidic covenant. It's going to be very, very good. Not just because I'm a good teacher, because I don't think that's the point. It's that this chapter is paramount for the Bible. This chapter springboards us to Jesus being born in the future. This is the promise of David's heritage eternal. David will have a son who will sit on an eternal throne. David's covenant with God. Very exciting. So come back, 2 Samuel chapter 7.